Good to see everybody here this evening for Vespers and, of course, Scott Kenworthy's presentation on St. Tikhon. This is one of the events of our 50th anniversary celebration. Key event, of course, the great saint of the church. We'll hear about that momentarily. I'd like to introduce Scott briefly, then we'll start with his talk and proceed from there. Scott Kenworthy is professor of history at Miami University, where he also teaches in the Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies and religious studies programs. In addition to a PhD in history, he holds a master's in theology from St. Vladimir's Seminary. He is the author of 3 books, including an introductory survey, Understanding World Christianity, Russia, with Alexander Ajibadjian. His latest book, which will appear in December or early January, is The People's Prophet, Tikhon Belavin and the Orthodox Church in North America and Revolutionary Russia, published by Oxford University Press. His research was supported by prestigious research grants such as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, Fulbright, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Some of those are now being defunded, unfortunately, but they help Scott with his work on the book. So please, Scott, he'll start, and we'll leave some time for a question and answer to follow. Scott's been making a book tour of the United States so far. He's been to many parishes, so good to have him here in our home parish of Christ the Savior, Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Father. It's nice to be able to talk to all of you. Father Stephen, brothers and sisters, Christ is in our midst.
It is never shall be.
I forgot my watch, so I'll have to follow my phone and restrain myself from talking for hours, which I could do, but I don't want to keep you here that long. So St. Tikhon, for those of you who are not familiar with him already, is known as the confessor of Russia and the enlightener of North America. So there are 2 reasons why he's an important saint for us. He was the Archbishop of North America for 8 years, from 1898 to 1907, at a really important time in the history of the American church, and did a lot of incredibly important things, laying the foundation for the further growth of the church in America, which I'll talk about. And he became Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1917, November 1917, at literally the same moment that the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, seized power in Russia, so was immediately thrust into a position of defending the church against a militant, atheist, totalitarian government. And he passed away in 1925, so this is the centenary of his repose. And of course, saints are very important for us in the Orthodox Church, but so many of the saints that we learn about from ancient times are people very distant to us, perhaps. Many of the saints, if you read the typical saints' lives, they all had pious childhoods and loved going to church and didn't play games with the other children, and things like this that are very stereotypical and maybe hard to relate to for those of us who are kinds of things that we do, but especially as a church leader, navigating new kinds of circumstances for the Orthodox Church, such as being an environment where there is religious plurality instead of in Russia, where the Orthodox Church was the predominant church, facing democratic governments, but also totalitarian governments, something hopefully we won't have to face, but types of political divisions and all these kind of things were things he experienced and had to navigate. And because the sources of his life are very rich, including his own personal letters that he wrote back to Russia from North America, and other types of sources, including the secret police file that the Soviets were keeping on him when he was patriarch, that became accessible after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's possible to tell his story in a way that's incredibly rich and therefore may speak to us today. It's a complicated book. It's not a short one. I spent over a decade working on it. So I had to try to combine writing a book that had the full academic rigor and made sense of all of the evidence that was out there with something that was also readable to all of you, hopefully. And as a sort of test case, I had Brian and Jennifer and Father Stephen and Presbytera reading through parts of it. So I hope that, got some feedback from them to make it more readable. You can ask them what they think. So thank you to all of you who did help me out. So to tell his story, he was born Vasily Ivanovich Belavin on January 19th, 1865, in a very small village of Klin in northwestern Russia, sort of halfway between Moscow and Riga, if you can envision that. So his father was a parish priest, so this was sort of the norm in 19th century Russia, that sons of priests usually followed in their father's footsteps. And the village that he was born in was very small and very poor, so that his family had to actually work the land just like the peasants did that they served. But when he was 4 years old, they moved to a nearby, the sort of district city of about 10,000 people, which is still to this day a really beautiful small city, also in northwestern Russia, Toropets, with a couple of large, lovely lakes. One city that wasn't destroyed during World War II, so it still looks, I was there about 10 years ago, still looks more or less, I think, like it looked when he was there, which is pretty unusual. From there, he also attended school. So also in 19th century Russia, they had an entire schooling system from basically elementary schools to the seminary, which was the equivalent of a high school level, all the way up to the theological academy, which was the equivalent of the university level, just for sons of clergy, right? They had their own unique school system. So he was a product of that school system, went to seminary in Pskov, and then studied at the Theological Academy in St. Petersburg in the 1880s. He was known among his classmates as being serious and devout, going to church, but also outgoing and friendly. He was sort of the life of a social gathering. He was not sort of, recluse monk type of a person, but was very outgoing. His fellow students in the seminary gave him the nickname Hierarch, almost kind of predicting where he would end up. And then even more prophetically, his classmates in the Theological Academy nicknamed him the Patriarch, very prophetically. And I should back up here for a moment. So in the Russian Orthodox Church, Peter the Great, around the year 1700, had abolished the patriarchate in Russia. So for 200 years, over 200 years, there was no patriarch in the Russian Orthodox Church. The patriarchate was replaced with the Holy Synod, a kind of body, standing body of bishops that administered the church rather than having a patriarch. So for his fellow students to call him the Patriarch as a nickname, first of all, it's very unusual apparently for them even to give nicknames to students, fellow students in the academy, and to give him that nickname was really quite striking. After finishing the Theological Academy, he had a choice of what to pursue. Was he going to get married and become a parish priest like his father? Was he going to take vows of celibacy and then potentially choose the career path that would end up being a bishop? Seems like he wasn't entirely certain when he finished seminary, because he is only, when he finished the Theological Academy, because he was only 22 years old or something like this. So he decided to go back to his alma mater of Pskov Seminary and teach as a seminary professor for several years and kind of testing his vocation. And then at the age of 27, he decided that he was going to embrace celibacy, and he was then took monastic vows, where he received the name Tikhon, and was shortly afterwards ordained to the priesthood. And then he was appointed to be the head of a seminary in Holm, which is today Chelm in eastern Poland, but at that point was part of the western part of the Russian Empire, where he spent most of the 1890s. And Holm was a special place because it was a place where Greek Catholics or Uniates had been, the last part of the Russian Empire where Greek Catholics had been before they were brought into the Orthodox Church, not that long before in 1875, so 17 years before he arrived there. And there was still some, questions of their transition to Orthodoxy. So for those of you unfamiliar, Greek Catholics are those who lived in places like Poland and Ukraine, who were Orthodox once upon a time in the Middle Ages, but then when they were living under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 17th century, were essentially brought under Rome, but retained their Eastern Rite liturgy and even married priesthood and things like this. So some of them were returning to the Orthodox Church in the Russian Empire, and that was his sort of constituency, and they'll be important later on in the story as well. He then became bishop for this region. His title was the Bishop of Lublin, which is near Holm in the eastern part of Poland. But he was there only less than a year before he was appointed to be the Bishop of North America, which initially was news that didn't exactly excite him because this was something totally unknown and new to him. He had served for less than a year as the Bishop of Lublin, and he liked it there, the people liked him, and things were going well. So he didn't exactly want to take on this enormous new challenge. But this was something that he met throughout his life. Must be the will of God, because I certainly didn't seek this out. And so he came to the United States at the end of 1898, and he's 33 years old, and he's the bishop of the largest diocese in the entire world, which at that point included the entirety of North America, the United States, Canada, and Alaska. And he's the only Orthodox bishop at that point in the entirety of North America. And he made it his vision to visit every single parish in North America. So he spent most of his time traveling incessantly. When he first arrived, another piece of background, Orthodoxy, as probably most of you are familiar with, first comes to North America through the Russian mission to Alaska. And so up until the end of the 19th century, Orthodoxy was primarily concentrated in Alaska. There was only a handful of Orthodox churches on the sort of lower 48, and none really in Canada until the very end of the 19th century. And so when Alaska was sold to the United States in 1867, they made the decision to move the bishop's see, the bishop's residence, from Sitka in Alaska to San Francisco, because San Francisco that way was on the mainland, so that for purposes of communicating with the government if necessary, or official business, was made that easier, but also you could hop on a boat and go to Alaska relatively easily. So when he arrives, the bishop's see is still in San Francisco. So when he arrives in San Francisco, he gives this very striking first speech to his sermon, to his flock in San Francisco, but also by extension to the entirety of North America, where he talks about having left behind everything, his family, his friends, everything known and familiar to him, to come to a completely new place, new people that is unfamiliar to him, but that he says that he comes to them in love and that he will devote his entire energies to them. And in return, he asks for their obedience, trust, and cooperation. And then he spends the rest of the speech talking about what he means by cooperation. And again, to give a little background, in 19th century Russia, bishops were very, figures with a lot of authority. And so you usually did not envision cooperating with bishops, right? Bishops told you what to do, whether you were a parish priest or, much less a lay person. But in this speech, he asks his American flock, both the priests but also the lay people, to be his co-workers, to cooperate with him in building up the church. And he addresses specifically the clergy, and he says, you know this land better than I do. You know the issues, the problems, so advise me, and I will work with you and support you. And then he turns to the people, the laity, and quotes John Chrysostom, and he says, don't put everything on the clergy, for, quote, you yourselves can do much. You know one another better than we do, end quote. And so, building on this analogy of the church as a body, he says every member is important. Every member has an essential role to play. Different role, right? Everybody doesn't play the same role, but everybody plays an important role. And again, this is very unusual language for a Russian bishop to be speaking in at the end of the 19th century. So for the next 5 years, he would effectively be spending half of the year on the road. And again, you can imagine turn of the century travel. He's going by railroad, he's going by horse-drawn carriages, he's going by boat all over the place. He's traveling from San Francisco to Minneapolis, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, all throughout Pennsylvania, because that's where a lot of the Orthodox churches were being established. New York, which would then serve as a hub to visit other places. When he gets to Cleveland, he writes back to Russia. He says, quote, my diocese is almost boundless. I have inspected all of but 4 parishes, but have already had to travel by railroad more than 5,000 kilometers, right? Inconceivable for Russia, where there's, churches everywhere. On the way back, he went through Galveston, so through the south where there was a parish, back to San Francisco. He's in San Francisco for 10 days to get caught up on paperwork before he hops on a boat to Alaska, and then traveling around the Alaskan islands and the coastal parts of Alaska and so on, so that in the end, he says he traveled 25,000 kilometers, 9,600 of which were by boat, right? Because to get to the islands and stuff in Alaska. One of the things that he realizes pretty much immediately in North America is that through most of the 19th century, the heart of Orthodoxy in North America was in Alaska. But beginning in the 1890s, this was the first beginning of a massive wave of immigrants coming to North America. And they were coming from not generally Russian, right? Although he was the representative of the Russian church. They were mostly people coming from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so places today that are in Ukraine and Czech and Slovakia and Poland and places like this, usually who came over as these Greek Catholics and then found they didn't have a very welcome reception by the Roman Catholic bishops, and so then, in order to preserve their traditions, converted to Orthodoxy in North America. But there were also Serbs and some Romanians and Syrians coming from the Ottoman Empire, Greeks as well. The Greeks were sort of a separate story because they generally ignored the Russian bishops, but everybody else looked to the bishop for their needs. The Greeks would just write home to their bishop, whoever was their bishop at home, and say, send us a priest, and things like that. And that remained the case kind of consistently. But the Serbs and the Syro-Arabs, as they called them in those days, would all look to the Russian bishop for their needs, to get the entumens, the myrrh, to help them find priests and things like this. So he realized that the diocese was changing incredibly rapidly because of this suddenly instead of Alaska, there being one pole of the diocese, now there were 2. There was the East Coast, because most of the immigrants were coming into the cities, industrial cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago, and many of them into coal mining districts in Pennsylvania and things like this, but all concentrated on the East Coast. The furthest west was Minneapolis. And so he's torn between giving the attention that it needs in Alaska on the one hand, and then doing all that he needs in the eastern part of the United States, which just requires him to travel so extensively that it's really exhausting for him. And among his travels, he does this second trip to Alaska. He goes into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region, where St. Olga, that we just canonized, was from, deep into the really difficult to reach, even apparently to this day, regions where no Orthodox bishop had ever been before. There had been an Orthodox presence there for nearly a century, but there had been no Orthodox bishop because it was so difficult to get to. And to get there, you'd sort of be cut off for such a long period of time. Then he's also the first Orthodox bishop to go to Canada. And again, he's going all over Canada, up to Alberta and Saskatchewan, and Edmonton, and these kinds of places, and going to these remote villages where homesteaders were setting up shop from these parts of the world and whatnot. And his travels could be very adventurous. Sometimes his Episcopal gear would not arrive with him, especially when he went to Canada. It kept seeming to get hung up at customs, so he'd have to serve in just priestly robes and things like this. There was another time where he had to make a kind of emergency trip to Canada. It was an unplanned one in March of, I think it was 1902 or something like this. And so he goes from San Francisco up to these northern parts of Canada before then heading back to the eastern coast of the United States where he had planned to go. And so he's in March in northern Canada, having just come from San Francisco. And so he's not quite ready for the weather there because it's still incredibly cold. And there, he says we're going across these long stretches and these horse-drawn carriages, open carriages where he's just in his riasa and he's freezing. So he says they'd have to jump out every once in a while and run behind the carriage just to stay warm. And you can imagine your riasa through the snow like that, right? And his trips by boat, they would stop at these islands. He'd often travel on mail boats to the islands in Alaska, and every time the mail boat would stop to drop off the mail, he'd get off and visit with the people who were there, and then hop back on the boat. And sometimes the boat would leave him. It was supposed to leave him for a few hours and go somewhere and then come back, but then a storm would hit and they wouldn't be able to pick him up for a couple days. They'd be stranded, and it was not easy travels, as you can imagine. Among his primary concerns in the first 5 years was building churches sort of worthy of the Orthodox congregations in the two most important cities in the United States at the time, which was Chicago and New York. So those two churches, he supported parishioners building churches all over the place, but those two consumed a particular amount of his attention, where he would make special trips to Chicago or to New York to help the people choose the plot of land that they were going to build the church on, and then later on, another special trip later on to go over the architectural plans with the architect and make decisions about those kinds of things, helped with the fundraising to build them. The Chicago Church, Holy Trinity, on Levitt Street, where I was giving a talk 2 weeks ago, they secured Louis Sullivan, one of the very famous architect, to actually build this church and so on. And then the one in New York on 97th Street was also really striking church. So those were consecrated in 1902. One of the biggest issues was finding priests, because to be a priest in the Orthodox Church, you have to have a seminary education. At that point, there was no seminaries in North America, so they tried to recruit priests primarily from Russia, but it was sometimes hard to get priests to come from Russia, or if they came, either they came because they were sort of looking for an adventure and didn't turn out necessarily to be the best priests, or they found America so hard to get used to that they didn't last very long and things like this. So he's constantly struggling with that. So after 5 years of this constant travel and pouring in so much energy into doing all of this, his brother, who had come with him to North America and was serving as his secretary in San Francisco, his brother suddenly died. His brother was younger than he was. And this was just sort of a devastating blow at a moment where he was already kind of, had it up to here, was just so exhausted by everything, so that he actually wrote back to the Holy Synod in Russia and said, I need a leave of absence, right, to come home to Russia to bring my brother's remains and bury him and just to rest. So they grant him this leave of absence. In 1903, he goes back, but instead of being able to relax, they assign him to the Holy Synod. So he spends most of 1903 serving on the Holy Synod, but he uses that. When he'd left North America, he was like, I'm not even sure I want to go back because I'm so exhausted. I've kind of had enough. And it was fairly normal for bishops in this time period in Russia to be transferred every 5 years or something like this. So he's like, they'll find me somewhere else to go. I've kind of had enough of North America. But once he got back to Russia and was on the Holy Synod, he's like, okay, now I can actually get things done for the North American church, but that need approval in Russia. And the most important, the sort of linchpin of all of his plans was that he needed the Russian church to assign an assistant bishop for Alaska, because that way there could be somebody in Alaska full-time to attend to all of the needs for Alaska, and then he and his successor could concentrate their energies on just the rest of the United States and Canada, right? But it would be easier. So after a lot of pressure, the Holy Synod was not very eager to grant this, but with enough pressure, they finally did. And so he comes back to the United States at the beginning of 1904 with a bishop who's going to be for Alaska. And the first thing they do when they're both there is consecrate a third bishop, who is Raphael Hawawini, who is one of these Syro-Arabs, who is kind of the head of the mission for the Syrian Christians in North America. So he's the first Orthodox bishop consecrated in the United States. And he appoints him as head of the sort of, all of the Syrians and Arab Orthodox Christians in the United States. And this was part of his vision that he had developed, was that Orthodoxy in North America was multi-ethnic, multi-national, whatever, different traditions where you had Russians, but also Rusins and Serbs and Romanians and Arabs, and that his vision would be that there would be one Orthodox church for North America, and there would be the Archbishop, who for the time being would still be appointed from the Russian Orthodox Church, but that then he would have bishops for, sort of under him, sort of assistant bishops within the diocese that would serve each of those national traditions, and each could have their own churches, their own traditions, and things like that, but at the same time they'd be unified in some kind of larger structure. And this was something he tried to do. It was a vision that he spelled out very clearly that effectively served as the basis for the establishment of it all falls apart in 1917 after the Russian Revolution, and there's a crisis in the Russian church, and after that point, then the Greeks and then everybody else sort of sends their own bishops, and we end up with the situation we have today where you have multiple jurisdictions, right? But in 1970, when the Orthodox Church of America was established and received autocephaly, it was the vision that inspired it was that given by St. Tikhon of a kind of one Orthodox Church for North America, but that would embrace all of its diversity within that and tolerate it and support it and everything else. Because he had built the church in New York, and now had a bishop for Alaska, his next piece of his plan. So he comes back, he's back in North America for 3 years, from 1904 to early 1907, and he accomplishes an enormous number of things in that span of 3 years that he had kind of laid the foundations for in his first 5 years while here. The first one of them, well, the first one was to get the bishop for Alaska. The second one was to consecrate Raphael Hawawini for the Arabs, Orthodox Christians. He planned to do the same thing for the Serbs. He had an archimandrite who was the head of the Serbian bishop. He wanted to make him a bishop too, but that didn't happen for various reasons. But then the next piece was to move the bishop's residence or see from San Francisco to New York, because from New York, then the bishop could travel to most of the rest of the diocese in, sort of much shorter trips. So it wouldn't require spending half the year on the road all of the time, but to be able to go to, Pennsylvania and even Chicago and Minneapolis at the furthest was much easier from New York than it was from San Francisco. So he does that. And then in his remaining time, he accomplishes a whole series of other really important things. I mentioned that one of his constant struggles was getting enough priests. So he realized that the only solution was that a seminary was needed in the United States to train Americans to become priests. So he establishes the first seminary in the United States in Minneapolis at that time. He establishes the first monastery, right? Monasteries have always been important in the Orthodox tradition. He kind of acknowledged that, the sort of monastic withdrawal and retreat wasn't necessarily that compatible with the American go-getter attitude and, concern with business and being practical. You use that word in English, even though he's writing in Russian. He says business. It's very funny. This kind of practical attitude of Americans, but nevertheless, we need a monastery. So St. Tikhon's monastery, still there in Pennsylvania, is established by him. He has to navigate the American environment of incredible religious diversity, where the Orthodox Christians are a tiny minority. There was competition, especially in Alaska, where there were missions aimed at the natives and often ones who are already Orthodox, both Catholic and Protestant. So there's some defensiveness in that arena. But in the United States, he developed, especially with the Episcopal Church at that time, where the Episcopal Church was still at least one strain within the Episcopal Church was kind of really open to Orthodoxy and wanted to draw the Episcopal Church closer to Orthodoxy. And so he developed very close ties with Bishop Grafton of the Episcopal Church, and he went to some of their events, of consecration of a bishop, and they came to the consecration of Raphael Hawawini and the churches in New York and Chicago and things like this. So very, very cordial relations there. He envisioned, of course, that eventually Orthodoxy in the United States would have to adapt to the English language. So he helped sponsor and promote and gave editorial commentary to Isabel Hapgood, who was also, by the way, Episcopalian, but a woman who was a translator of French and Russian literature. She knew Tolstoy and things like this. And so she translated the service book that was in use for a very long time. The Hapgood service book was not replaced for a long time with all the services. It's a pretty thick book, Vespers and burial services and all of these kinds of things. So he found the money to have that published and all those kind of things. And then he culminated his time in North America with the first council. So there was kind of looking forward that councils hadn't happened in the Russian church for over 200 years and had never happened in North America either. And so there was this sort of new emphasis on conciliarism as the way the Orthodox Church should operate, where everybody, clergy and laity, have a say. It's not just a sort of top-down hierarchical thing. So he convenes the first the first council in North America, which we still, the OCA, we call that the first All-American Sabor, the first All-American Council, and look back to. So then he returns to Russia in 1907 and is appointed as the Archbishop of Yaroslavl, where he is from 1907 to 1913. He's made Archbishop of Vilnius, today the capital, of course, of Lithuania, but at that point still also part of the Russian Empire. So that was another kind of unique place for him. He serves there from 1914 to 1917 in the midst of World War I, which is sort of, he's very close to the front lines and has to deal with the war and all those kind of things. In February, March 1917, the monarchy falls in Russia, and there is this sort of brief moment of an attempt to establish democracy in Russia in 1917. And so there, among other things, you have this sort of democratic ethos sweeping not only the country, but also the church. And so some of the old bishops were voted out of office. And so they had elections for the bishops of Moscow and St. Petersburg for the first, I think the only time in history. And he became the first popularly elected Archbishop of Moscow in the summer of 1917. It's also a very, very interesting moment, kind of revealing about him. And then when the Church Council begins in August 1917, finally this first effort to really address so many issues that needed to be kind of revivified in the Church of Russia, which had been, people were frustrated that it had been too tied to the government, too kind of subordinated to the government. It needed to be freer and independent and look at things like liturgical practice and kind of sharing authority so it wasn't so top-down and things like this. And so that begins to meet in August 1917, but the political situation is still unstable in Russia, so that at the very end of October 1917, the Bolsheviks seize power. They overthrow the democratic government. Right? These are kind of hardline, ultra, the sort of furthest left-wing Marxist group who wants to do away with private property, and but in a way that's completely dictatorial, right? They are the only game in town. They're establishing a kind of one-party state where their ideology is the sort of the only acceptable one, and it's vehement kind of atheism that they want to uproot the church, not only disestablish it and separate it from the government, but literally make everybody atheist, And so he's thrown into this position of having to defend the church while the government is trying to strip it of its property. It's even its right to own the very church buildings. He has to follow this very fine line where he's defending the church. So he's criticizing the government's actions against the church, but without trying to put himself in a position where he's attacking them per se, right? He says, I'm not a counter-revolutionary. It's up to the people to decide what kind of government we have. It's not up to me or the church to decide. But at the same time, the majority of the people are Orthodox, and if you're claiming to be the people's government, you shouldn't be doing something that goes against the will of the majority of the people. And so that's kind of the position that he's trying to take. Russia then plunges into a civil war between the Reds, that is the Soviets, the communists on the one hand, and the monarchist, anti-Soviet white armies. So he has to they're on the outskirts in Siberia and southern Russia, where of course he's still in Moscow, which is controlled by the Soviets. So he has to, again, be extremely cautious, and he says the church is neutral. We're not taking sides in this political battle. We are, we're doing the church thing, right? Not playing partisan politics, as it were, in the midst of this. But he continued to have this independent voice. He was the one person who could speak his mind in Russia and not basically be shot or arrested or sent to the gulag. And the reason was because their political opponents, they had no qualms about, taking care of, but because he is the head of the church, which still there are, 100,000 communists in Russia in 1919 or 1920. There's 100 million Orthodox Christians, right? So they know that he has probably more support than they do, and they have to be very cautious what they deal with him. Also, as an international, head of the largest Orthodox church in the world, they can't just do away with him. So they're always looking for pretexts to somehow like arrest him and either undermine his authority or even put him on trial. They try for years to find something, but they don't actually have anything on him to prove he's like a counter-revolutionary or something like this. And then by the end of the Civil War, there's a horrendous famine. I mean, I think like 5 million people die from this famine in 1921, 1922. And he offers to help do famine appeal and raise money and things like this. And he does they allow him to issue an international appeal that actually, among other things, reaches Herbert Hoover, who comes in with the American Relief Administration. And Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration came in and probably saved 10 million lives in Russia in 1921, 1922. But they didn't want him to look too good from this, so they didn't let him do the internal fundraising that he wanted to do, which probably would have also saved millions of lives. And so then in 1922, the government officials decide they want to confiscate all of the valuables from within churches. So that would be, the silver frames around icons, gold or silver chalices, all this kind of stuff. And it's really just to fill the coffers of the government, which is completely broke by this point. But they pass it off as saying that it's for famine relief. And when he tries to kind of negotiate with this, to cooperate so that the church can voluntarily give up some things, but not consecrated chalices and things like this. And they just sort of dismiss him and say they issue a decree that they're just going to come in and take whatever they want. And so he responds to this with a kind of declaration that to take consecrated things like chalices is blasphemy. And whether it was the consequence of his statement or just the spontaneous, natural response of believers, but when these Soviet agents came to churches to basically ransack them, people, stood outside and tried to barricade them from getting into their churches, and there were skirmishes and conflicts, and sometimes people were killed. And so the government finally now we have the excuse that he's causing people to resist the government. He's calling people to break the law and counter the government. So they arrest him in May 1922. Part of the plan was to split the Russian Orthodox Church from within. So they allow this kind of fellow travelers among the clergy, sort of very liberal priests who want to carry out all these church reforms, but are also very willing to declare their loyalty to the Soviet government. They let these guys take over the church administration while Patriarch Tikhon is under arrest. They begin to carry out some of these church reforms, like having married bishops and things like this, which kind of splits the church, which was part of the point. He's under arrest he's incarcerated mostly in a monastery. He's like restricted to like 2 rooms. He can't leave for over a year, from May 1922 until the end of June 1923. And all this while they were interrogating him. So part of what I used for the book is the records of the interrogations that the secret police is conducting with him. And was supposed to then culminate in a trial where, of course, the outcome was preordained, that he was going to be found guilty of counter-revolution and then executed. And in the spring of 1923, when they announced that the trial was about to take place, and at the same time they had arrested the leading Catholic bishop and put him on trial already, and given them death sentences, and actually executed not the main bishop, but one of his subordinate priests. there was this huge international backlash, right? It was just all over Europe and the United States, this kind of shock and horror about what the Soviets were doing, and especially the British. So just when they were about to put him on trial, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement jointly with the chief rabbi in England, as well as the head of the Methodist Church, and I think the Baptist Church, and all these other religious leaders. They issued a joint statement in his defense. The Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople also issued a very strong defense of Tikhon and kind of condemnation of religious persecution in the Soviet Union. And so there was so much international backlash that the Soviet leadership said, okay, we've got to figure out what to do here. So they put it on pause. They were still planning on going through with it while they were trying to figure out. They said, we need more propaganda, right? That was the first solution. But then a few weeks after that, the British foreign minister, Lord Curzon, issued this ultimatum that had to do with a whole bunch of points about British-Soviet relations, but one of those points was about religious freedom and specifically about Patriarch Tikhon. It was pretty clear that if they executed him, that was going to rupture trade relations that had recently been established between Britain and the Soviet Union at a moment when the Soviet Union was kind of on the verge of financial collapse. So it's like, okay, we can't do that. So that really saves his life. They drop the trial, and then they try to pivot and figure out, well, we can't just let him go. We have to somehow save face. So they negotiate with him for him to issue this statement that he's not an enemy of the Soviet government and things like this. And they release him so that he not only is able to be free, but they actually allow him to resume the patriarchate, to become, they could have exiled him or sent him to America or something like this, but instead they allow him to become patriarch again, and he spends basically the last 2 years of his life trying to rebuild the church because of this schism with these so-called renovationists or living church. He's trying to build it back. And it's also, the last 2 years are incredibly complicated of he's negotiating because they're still trying to pressure him to compromise, and he's trying to find a way to get the church legalized within the Soviet Union so that there can be, in the mid-20s, it seemed like there might be some possibility of a coexistence, right? When Stalin comes to power at the end of the 1920s, then it's, they literally just start killing everybody. But in the mid-20s, it still seemed like some sort of coexistence might be possible, so he's trying to secure that. But all of this pressure in the last years of his life and being interrogated endlessly, and also when they wanted to pressure him, what they would do, because they weren't going to go after him anymore, is they would arrest the people around him. If he wasn't compromising, they would arrest all of the people and send them to the gulag and things like this, right? And you can imagine the pressure that put on him and the weight that it had. So his health began to decline by the end of 1924, and then especially he spent basically the last a few months of his life in 1925 in a kind of private clinic and things like that. But instead of getting rest all of the time, he's still like out there serving liturgies, and things like this. So it kind of continues to take its toll on his health. So he dies in April 1925, sort of combination of heart and kidneys, I think it was, or liver. There had always been speculation that he was actually poisoned by the Soviets. I did not find any evidence to confirm that, and circumstantial evidence suggests not. But that's another story. He was, of course, for the rest of the Soviet Union, he was held as an exemplar, as a great person in the church in North America by what becomes the OCA. People like Father Alexander Schmemann and Father Leonid Kushkovsky, the kind of founding fathers of the OCA, really saw him as a pivotal figure in the American church, but also Rokor, the Russian church outside of Russia, saw him as, defending the church against the Soviets and things like this. And then at the very end of the Soviet regime, when there's perestroika, Gorbachev, he begins to relax things and open things up. Within the Soviet Union, the Soviets always treated him as like enemy of the people #1, right? Because he was anti-Soviet and all this sort of stuff. But finally, in that brief moment at the end, they relax things so that he's actually canonized just before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. So that's his life story in a nutshell. But you have to read the book to get all of the details. So, thank you. And I'm happy to take questions if we have a few minutes. Yeah. Yeah. I pressured Oxford University Press because normally these kind of books, academic books, are like over $100. And I said, people are actually going to want to read this book, so don't prove me wrong. So they priced it at $35, which is amazing for a 400-page hardcover. It's pretty good. That's a question that is not very clear to answer. So there was actually in the seminaries, they really emphasized languages. So they took like years and years and years and years of Greek and Latin. But his language was French. So that he actually taught French when he went back to Pskov Seminary. So he mentions in one letter, it's like, well, I know English theoretically, but I'm always surrounded by Russian, so I don't really have much of a chance. But he does. I have a few letters that he wrote in English. So, yeah.
What were the main reasons, the points of his canonization? Usually, you see like St. Olga, they discovered the miracles that she brought, and he wasn't a miracle worker in that way.
Right.
So what were the points of his canonization?
Well, what's so interesting is that because it's still the Soviet Union, right? Even if it's perestroika, but it's 1989, they can't canonize him as a confessor who suffered because of Soviet persecution. So they don't mention that in the canonization documents at all. It's as a missionary, as somebody who defended and unified the church from this living church schism, things like that were what it was. But the real reason, or one of the most important reasons, right, is somebody who's defending the church against this Soviet government. They kind of sidestepped that at the time of his actual canonization. Yeah.
Where is he buried?
It's an interesting story there too. So he was buried in the church, one of the churches, not the main cathedral, but a smaller church in the Donskoy Monastery, which is where he had been under this kind of house arrest. But he stayed in the Donskoy Monastery even after they released him from the house arrest. He didn't move. He just stayed where he was. So they buried him, but they buried him like under the floor. And apparently they had removed some 19th century heating duct to push his coffin far underneath, because there was this fear that the Soviets might steal his body and make it disappear, because they knew that people, believers would venerate him. And so nobody knew actually where, even when they canonized him, they didn't know where his body was. And it was only a few years later, I forget exactly, it's like 1994 or something like this, where there was a fire in that church, and so they had to do some renovations, and they were reconstructing things, and they discovered his coffin and stuff. And so his relics are now in the main cathedral in the Donskoy Monastery in Moscow. Right.
I was curious when you mentioned that you were using KGB files to look at the story. Were there times where you found out things in those files that maybe
Oh, yeah. Oh, all kinds of stuff. So, first of all, so the, secret police archives, which still are in the hands of the Federal Security Bureau in Russia, FSB, its successor, I requested to work in the archive itself, but was not allowed. But fortunately, there's a St. Tikhon's University in Moscow, which of course, as you can imagine, does a tremendous amount of research into his life and publishing documents. They had access to it in the pre-Putin years, the very end of the 90s, and published this 1,000-page collection of documents. Apparently it's not all of it, but it's a huge amount of it. And in addition to that, they have published the documents from the Politburo, which was the political bureau, was the head of the Communist Party that was really the decision-making body. The Politburo, which was, Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all those people, they would make the decisions and then, behind the scenes dictate to the courts and to the press and to various government bodies, this is what you have to do, making it look like it's, the courts making decisions on their own or the government bodies doing things on their own, but the decisions were really being made by the Politburo. And then another thing that was created by the Politburo was this anti-religious commission. And they were the ones who were kind of micromanaging the situation. And nobody even knew. In fact, nobody knew of the existence of this anti-religious commission until the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's how secret it was. And so, he was dealing with this one secret police officer, this young guy who was not very well educated, Yevgeny Tuchkov. He's dealing with this guy all the time, but he has no idea who's actually standing behind him and all of the machinations that are going on behind the scenes and stuff like that, yeah. So, yeah, you can imagine for him, the whole thing of the confiscation of the church valuables was sort of planned out to, sort of lead where it did. But they're, what's being said in the press is that it's all about famine relief and stuff like this, but what's actually going on is something different. He guessed about it. There were enough clues that he kind of figured out what was probably the real motivation behind it, but of course he had no way of knowing that directly, yeah. Yeah, so I'm triangulating all of these sources, as well as his statements, his public statements, but also as the years go on, he's increasingly just writing these letters to the Soviet leaders, trying to state his case and things like that, which also are things that have only come to light recently.
John, you have a question? Do you have any favorite aphorisms or sayings of St. Tikhon?
Huh.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, the question was if I had any favorite aphorisms or sayings. I've never thought about that one, so I'll have to take a hold. There's nothing that jumps to mind. One of the things that's really kind of astounding is in the midst of all this anti-religious persecution, he writes this letter to the Soviet leaders where he says, look at history. Guys, look at history, right? Whenever people have tried to persecute religion, it only makes the religion stronger. So if you guys are claiming to be progressive, you should be allowing for greater freedom, not returning to this medieval, like you're the Inquisition or something like this. And he goes so far as to say that the Edict of Milan, passed by the Emperor Constantine in 312, the Edict of Milan, the Reformation, and the rights of man are great monuments of human freedom, which is, I think, pretty unusual for a Russian Orthodox bishop, patriarch to be saying.
Well, okay, once again, we really thank Scott. A wonderful, wonderful presentation. Please pick up your flyers. When will the book come out?
So probably 2 months, exactly 2 months. So this is the official OCA icon of him, which the OCA allowed me to use. I proposed, I thought a standard kind of portrait of him or something, but the editor actually liked this and chose that. Yeah, it is. Presbytery.
Are we going to venerate the cross or not?
And if you have any more questions, I'll be back there.